Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to go through the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. As you can see on the screen, this is all taken from Mr. Bruff's Guide to My Last Duchess. You can pick that up through following the link in the video. It's exclusively available at mrbruff.com. What I've done is, in the past when I've done these poetry analysis videos, they're so detailed that people say I can't write it all down. So what I've done is I've written up everything I'm about to tell you, and it's about 4,500 words in total, and you can download it through clicking the link below. So let's have a look at the poem. The first thing to do when you're analysing a poem is to look at the poet, but it's really important that you don't just learn everything about the poet. When we're analysing a poem, it's important to just study those biographical details of the poet's life which seem key to understanding the poem itself. So with My Last Duchess, this is quite a challenge because Browning's dramatic monologue was not written from his own point of view, but that of a fictional character. My Last Duchess is set in the Italian Renaissance and focuses on a controlling and possibly insane duke. How can that possibly link to the poet's own life? Well, nevertheless, there are some biographical details worth looking at, which might help us understand the poem a little better. Here is Browning himself. So Browning was born in 1812 in London, died in 1889 in Venice. He didn't enjoy school much, and he ended up being homeschooled by tutors who educated him using his father's library, which had 6,000 books in it. Now, this brave move paid off because by the age of 14, he was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and age 12 wrote his first book of poetry. In 1845, Browning married Elizabeth Barrett. Now, Barrett is a famous poet herself, but the marriage was kept secret to begin with, as Elizabeth's father was domineering and controlling. In 1838, Browning visited Italy for the first time, and he would end up living there for much of his adult life, and wrote poems that say things like, "Open my heart, and you will see graved inside it, Italy." And My Last Duchess was published in 1842. So what can we conclude? Why am I telling you these particular details about the poet's life? Well, firstly, we can see the poet lived during the Victorian era, which is important, and I'll talk about that in a second. But secondly, the details of Barrett's controlling attitude towards his daughter pose a striking resemblance to the Duke in My Last Duchess. But this is what we call a red herring, because actually this poem was written before the two met. So these are the sorts of things you have to look out for when you're analysing poetry. It's not about his father-in-law. He hadn't even met him by that point. You've got to be careful when you find those details. Of course, the fact that Browning visited Italy shortly before the publication of the poem would back up the idea that actually it might be based on a true story he heard whilst he was travelling. But I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. So what do we mean by the word context? We essentially mean what was going on at the time that the poem was written. Although My Last Duchess is set in the Italian Renaissance between the 14th and 16th century, it was written and published during the Victorian era in 1842. So we should examine what was going on in Victorian England to see if there's anything which seems important to our understanding of the poem. There are a few things to talk about. Of course, the Italian Renaissance, there's the famous Renaissance painting by Raphael on the left, and Victorian England are two very different times. But quite often, if a poet or a novelist has an idea or a message that they want to get across, and it's quite a sort of shocking or critical message about the society that they live in, they will quite often then set their text in a different context so that it kind of covers it up a bit and they're not just openly criticising or not so openly criticising the context that they're writing in. Well, one of the major issues with studying context is that it can take hundreds of hours of study, and a lot of that might revolve around topics which are irrelevant to the poem being studied. So my advice is to look at the general contextual topics surrounding when a poem or a text was written, and then to think about which ones should we look at further, which ones seem to be relevant to the poem. So let's do that with My Last Duchess, 1842. That's the early part of the Victorian era, and during this period of time there was an array of changes in society. Three major areas: industrialisation, mass migration from the country to the city. In 1837, 80% of the population lived in the countryside. Most people worked on farms or spun wool, but with the Industrial Revolution came machines that could complete the work in a fraction of the time, and as a result people began moving into the cities to get work, and within a dozen years or so 50% of the population lived in the city. Industrialisation is a huge factor in Victorian England, but doesn't seem to be something that we see in the poem. The second one is attitudes to women. Attitudes to women were changing in the Victorian period. A woman's role was seen as the angel of the house who existed to serve and entertain her husband, but that was beginning to be challenged. Women were not given the same education as men, but the suffrage movement was growing and the battle for equality was also growing. The third one is religion. Attitudes to religion were being challenged due to the theory of evolution and scientific developments, which seemed to disprove some biblical teachings. And there are minor ways we could link religion to the poem, but obviously the key thing contextually is attitudes to women. Now, whether you're writing about context or not, you still need to write about the writer's ideas and themes, which in this case will link to power and gender discrimination. So if you're doing this exam 2015 or 16 AQA, you don't want to write about Victorian England, but you do want to write about the poet's ideas and messages relating to gender, power, women and that kind of thing. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what it was like for women in this time period. Well, the first thing is when a woman married, she became the legal property of her husband, which is just unbelievable, really. Women were not allowed to testify in court. Women could not vote. It was actually believed that women were incapable of rational thought. And at the time, there were many female writers, but a lot of them published their works anonymously or under male pseudonyms in order to boost their book sales and get their work taken seriously. Jane Austen, for example, published all of her novels anonymously. So it's a very shocking time of inequality when it comes to attitudes to women. And this topic is obviously a relevant contextual factor in the poem. The whole poem explores attitudes to women. So could it be that Browning uses the poem to explore his opinion on this topic? I think it could. It is possible to see this poem then as a criticism of Victorian attitudes to women and their effort to suppress female sexuality. It can be argued that the Duke's obsession with fixing the behaviour of his wife links to Victorian society's obsession with the reputation of women being perfect. We could also suggest that Victorian men are weakened by their dependency on power that they have over women, and the way in which Victorian men are obsessed with their power over women is certainly something we see in the poem. It seems that the men in this context saw their wives as a reflection of themselves. There is a different context to this poem as well, which is obviously when it was set. And this is just an aside for a minute or two. It's quite interesting, but it's not something you'd write about in the exam, but it is useful to help our understanding of the poem. Lots of speculation about whether this is based on a true story and who it is based on, and nothing's known for sure, so I'm not going to go into it. But many of Browning's poems, including My Last Duchess, were set in Ferrara, which is a town in Italy. Now, Browning seemed to be pretty much obsessed with the place. He researched its medieval history, and in My Last Duchess, it's believed it was based on this guy, Alfonso II, who was the 5th Duke of Ferrara, and his first wife died in suspicious circumstances. There's an idea this might be based on that. But as I say, this is the kind of detail that you're not actually going to write about in the exam. It's interesting, but it's not something that you will be relevant to an exam response. And of course, Browning's not the first poet to focus his work on the lives of despotic Italian people. Dante's Inferno has a number of stories of various cruel Italians. John Keats was another poet who focused on a similar topic in his poem Isabella. Now, when you've understood a bit about the poet and a bit about the context, it's important to just get the literal meaning of the poem. And obviously what I'm trying to do in this video is teach you how to analyse all poems in in literature. So what's going on in the poem? And what I'll do is, you can see it's a long poem. I'll translate it into modern English for you. So that's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now, Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. So what we have is the speaker, who of course is the Duke. He's looking at a painting, showing somebody a painting, and he's saying, that's a painting of my last wife on the wall there. It looks lifelike, or perhaps it's suggesting something else, which I'll talk about later. I would say that painting is a very realistic portrait. A famous artist worked hard all day painting it, and there she is. Then the poem moves on and says, wilt please you sit and look at her? I said, Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst how such a glance came there. Now what does that mean? Well, basically the Duke is saying, will you please sit down and look at the painting? I name-dropped the famous artist Fra Pandolf on purpose because people always look at this painting and they turn around and they want to ask me, how is it that that look on your wife's face was arrived at? And everybody asks that question. Not the first are you to turn and ask thus, sir. 'Twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. Now, what does this mean? Well, basically, the Duke is saying, no, it wasn't only me who could make my wife look so happy. So the look on his wife's face is a kind of a blush or a look of happiness. And he's saying, no, it's not just me as a husband who could make her feel that way. It might be that the artist flattered her, perhaps saying, your shawl's too long, pull it up a bit, show a bit of flesh, being a bit flirtatious. Or maybe he told her that, oh, it's impossible for paint to recreate something so beautiful as you, and she was so delighted that she blushed. Back to the poem. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries, some officious fuel, broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech or blush at least. So what's he saying here? Bizarrely, he's saying that she was a woman who was too easily impressed by things. She liked everything she looked at, and she looked at everything. And everything was the same. The effect I had on her as her husband was the same as when she looked at the sunset, or when somebody who admired her bought her some cherries, or when she rode her horse. Everything impressed her and made her happy. She blushed with delight at everything. Moving on then, she thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you the skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss, or there exceed the mark, and if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. A little bit sinister now coming in. So what's he saying? He's saying, well, she thanked people. She was polite as a woman, and that's good. But she thanked people in a way that it made me feel like she wasn't sufficiently grateful for the ancient and honoured surname which became hers when we got married. And, who's going to lower themselves to argue with her? Even if I was a good enough communicator to do it, and I'm not, I wouldn't do it. I'd have to lower myself down to her level to tell her to stop behaving this way, and I never lower myself. Back to the poem. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed by, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together there she stands as if alive. So this is the really ambiguous part of the poem, basically saying, you know, sir, she smiled whenever I went by, but then she smiled like that at everybody, and in the end, I gave some commands, and we'll talk about that later, and then there were no more smiles. But in this painting, she looks lifelike, or perhaps in this painting, she looks alive. Will please you rise, we'll meet the company below then, I repeat. The Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go through together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which claws of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So at this point we realise who the Duke is speaking to. And he's speaking to an envoy who works for somebody else. So he's basically saying, will you please stand up now? I've shown you the painting of my last wife. I've told you the story of her, that she was too happy and everything made her happy, and, you know, therefore I stopped that. Now we'll meet the others downstairs. The Count, your boss, is so rich, I'm sure he'll give me a nice financial incentive for marrying his daughter. But what I want is the daughter herself, not the money so much. And before we go down, have a look at this statue. It's a statue of Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, taming a seahorse. And it's a rare statue by a famous artist. So the poem is long and is quite confusing. But, you know, really it's just a man showing another man a painting of his ex-wife, which bizarrely is kept behind a curtain. So you pull back a curtain and there's a painting of his wife smiling. And she's got a sort of rosy cheeks, or she's blushing. And he says, you know what, everything made her happy. And I didn't like that, so I stopped it. And now I want to marry the daughter of your boss. And let's go and carry on our conversation. So let's have a think. There she is, the beautiful My Last Duchess. Let's have a think of the theme of this poem then. Now we understand the basics of the poem, it's important to consider the major themes. What is the poem trying to say? We need to move beyond what happens in the poem, which is the subject, to what the poem is trying to say. Does it have a message or a moral? And there are a number of themes, but all of them revolve around one major theme, which is power. There are two distinct types of power demonstrated in the poem. There's political power, which we see through the Duke's political power is demonstrated through the ambiguous line, I gave commands. The reader is left wondering, who were these commands given to? No doubt a servant, some sort of social inferior. And then there's domestic power. The Duke wishes to assert the power that he has in his kind of political sphere over his wife. And that links to the themes of the role of women and gender roles, sexism, inequality, that kind of thing. So now we're going to have a look at the language that is used in the poem. When you're analysing any literature text, you analyse through language, structure and form. Now, language refers to the words which are used by the poet, and it's the simplest type of analysis, and it's the one which most students write about first. So you're basically picking out words or phrases which seem important. Sometimes it might be similes and metaphors, but it might just be a single word that seems to be significant. If you can, though, in your exam, you should aim to analyse and make points about structure and form, because those are the trickier bits. So structure refers to the organisation of a poem. So it'll be thinking about things like, where do the verses break? Where do the stanzas break, if at all? Why do they change where they change? Is there variation in verse length? Does the poet use enjambment, repetition, rhyme? What's the rhythm like? Where do the stress patterns change? Is there a rhyme scheme? Is it free verse? Where's the punctuation? Why is it important? But we only want to analyse the structure if it links to something important about the poem. So, for example, if you're going to write about the exclamation mark at the end of the poem, you only want to write about it if you can link it to the theme of power or whatever the exam question is about. And form is referring to the times when poets follow particular rules about the organisation of a text. So is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Is it a ballad? But again, you've got to link it to the theme or the exam question. It's no good just what we call device spotting, like, oh, there's a simile, there's a metaphor, there's some alliteration. It's why is that important, and how does it help our understanding of the poem? And I think one of the key things about this poem as we move into analysing the language is that we first need to establish, did the Duke have any cause for concern with his last wife? Because the Duke says things like, and I can't remember if I put it on the animation here or not. No, I didn't. Okay. So the Duke, sorry to make you dizzy with the animation. The Duke says things like, her looks went everywhere. And this makes the reader think, well, is he implying that his wife was promiscuous? Did she flirt with other people? But I don't think the Duchess, and I'll explain this again in a second, I don't think the Duchess was a flirt or promiscuous at all. It's clear that the Duke was disgusted with his previous wife, but it's ironic when we look at the qualities of the Duchess. She was actually humble, grateful. She was pleased by simple things such as the dropping of the daylight. So she seems to have an almost childlike innocence to her. But that's not necessarily a positive. The 19th century feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft once wrote that while children should be innocent, when the epithet is applied to men or women, it is but a civil term for weakness. In other words, we expect children to be innocent, but if adults are innocent, we're basically saying that they're weak. So in other words, the wife is presented by the Duke as weak and undeserving of such an amazing husband that he is. So no, the Duchess didn't do anything wrong. I will explain that further in a second. The Duke is just this controlling, madman, and that's where we're going to now move into the use of language to present that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the characterization of the Duke, how the Duke is presented, and I'm going to analyze language and then structure and form to look at how the Duke is presented. Here's the poem all on one tooth. Amazing. So the first thing to talk about is the pronoun my, which is repeated throughout the poem, and that shows how the Duke is possessive. It's all about him. He is self-obsessed, and he believes that his wife belongs to him. So he's not a, but he sees her as one of his objects that he owns. The next thing is the talk about Frau Pandolf, this famous artist. Now, Frau Pandolf and Claus of Innsbruck are both name dropped. They're not real artists, but they are, for the purpose of this poem, used to show how vain the Duke is. When people know somebody famous and they want to throw it into a conversation, it's showing off, it's being vain. But the title Frau is also important. Frau means brother, and that title brother suggests that the artist was perhaps a monk or certainly a religious figure. So the suggestion here is that the picture was painted by a monk, or some religious figure. And why is that important? Well, it seems that Browning wanted to make it clear that the artist was not at all romantically involved or even flirting with the Duchess. So when the Duke says, he might have said this, he might have flirted with her or given her a little, flirtatious comment to sort of provoke the look in her face, it seems that he's actually just being paranoid, which again, if this is a monk or religious figure, again backs up the innocence of the Duchess. She's unlikely to have actually been suspicious in any way here if it's just a religious figure who is painting her. What about the word sir? The manner in which the Duke speaks to the envoy through the terms sir and you, these are formal terms of address. They actually might seem quite polite to a modern reader, but they're not. They clarify the Duke's superiority over the envoy. The more personal terms of thou and thee might have been used if they were on a friendly terms or equal terms. So the Duke is keen to point out that he is socially superior, and I would say this presents him as condescending. Now, a couple of things here. The Duke is proud. He feels that the fact that his wife has married him and in doing so has inherited this 900-year-old name is something she should be delighted at. It's a gift. So my surname is Bruff. Okay, so when I married my wife, Claire Cunningham was her name, and when she married me, she became Claire Bruff. And in this analogy, she should be delighted and proud of the fact that I gave her my name, Bruff. So this is a very proud character being presented. It's also a character who's disingenuous, who lies to us, who is clearly not telling the truth, because he says, I could have stopped to speak to my wife and tell her, you know, what she was doing wrong and what annoyed me, but I don't have the skill in speech. And you think, well, hang on a minute, you do have skill in speech. For a start, you're talking in perfect iambic pentameter, which I'll come to in a minute. But also, you know, you're delivering this long, well-structured argument to your visitor and, you know, someone you don't know. So don't kind of pretend you wouldn't be able to, you know, just have a chat with your wife and say, look, could you stop doing this? It's really frustrating me. So he's disingenuous. There's reason to believe that we can't trust everything that he says. He's also self-obsessed, which is seen through the repetition of the pronoun I. You can see the arrows here pointing. I choose, I passed, I gave, I repeat. This man is self-obsessed. It's all about him, which is, of course, you know, what we see through the repetition. We then see a very controlling aspect of the character when he seems to ask questions. There's a question earlier on, will it please you sit? And a question now, will it please you rise? But these are not really questions at all, they're demands. The Duke frames his demands as questions, but make no mistake, this is a social superior demanding something from an inferior. He's a controlling character. And we see that through the fact as well that the Duke remains stood. So the envoy sits down, and that is a symbol. When we look up to people, so the envoy would literally have to look up to the Duke. And of course, that's something that we learn from a child to parent relationship, this symbolism of looking up to someone. We say, oh, I look up to him, I admire him. It's a symbol of a child looking up to a parent. So the Duke makes the envoy sit down, and in doing so symbolizes again his controlling character, but also the fact that he is, you know, the superior. So not a very pretty picture presented at all of the Duke. The language in the poem suggests that the Duke is proud, possessive, controlling, vain, condescending, disingenuous, self-obsessed, and irrational. There are a couple of other interesting things. Now, the poem doesn't have a lot of poetic devices in it, such as similes and metaphors. And on the one hand, that makes sense because this is supposed to be a poem which, as a dramatic monologue, is just like a conversation. So in real conversation, we don't talk in similes and metaphors, do we? But there are a couple of examples where there are metaphors. And one of those is with this piece of artwork which is talked about at the end of the poem, the Clause of Innsbruck statue of Neptune taming a seahorse. Now, what does that mean? Well, Neptune was the Roman god of the sea, and he is presented, as in this picture, as this big, strong, barrel-chested, you know, masculine, domineering god. And here he is in the sea taming a wild creature. So that reflects, that is a metaphor for the Duke himself and how he feels, or what he feels his role is over women. I am here to domineer and control you and to tame you. You know, this is my domain. You're in the sea, the world, which is the male-dominated society of Victorian England. Remember, you know, obviously it's set in Italian Renaissance, but in terms of what Browning is saying, and the man's job is to dominate the woman and to tame her as if she's wild. There's also another metaphor in the poem, which is, of course, the painting itself. As I talked about earlier, it is hidden behind a curtain, which only the Duke can pull back. Now, it's interesting to think about this because the Duke didn't like that his wife smiled at people, everybody. He just wanted those smiles for himself. Now, what he's done is he's got a painting of her smiling and he's put a curtain in front of it, which only he can pull back. So now he gets to control the smiles of his wife and have them just for himself, which is what he wanted in life. So we can see quite a clever bit of metaphor and symbolism here, that he gets to control the wife, his past wife, and in theory his future wives as he wants. Very clever. Now, of course, it's ambiguous all the way through. Did he have his wife killed for what he didn't like in her or not? And I'll talk about those ambiguities in another section of this video. But let's have a look at the form of the poem. My Last Duchess is an example of a dramatic monologue, which means that the poem contains a single person giving a speech to somebody else. But the speaker is not the poet. So this isn't Robert Browning talking. And the listener, the envoy, is silent throughout. We don't hear them speak. Now, what that means is we're listening to a one-way conversation. And that's a form which is used in poetry because it allows us to identify the speaker's character from what they say. The reader becomes almost a detective, analysing clues which reveal key details about the speaker, in this case the Duke. And there's a gap between what the speaker wants us to know and what the reader can read between the lines. This poem is written entirely in iambic pentameter, which is lines of 10 syllables per line, with every other syllable being stressed. And the rhyme scheme is also tightly controlled, with the whole poem being written in rhyming couplets. So let's put those two things together. You can see wall, call, hand, stand, said, read, etc. This tight control of rhyme scheme and the amount of syllables per line reflects the tight control of the Duke, how he is an extremely controlling character. So that is an example of form reflecting content, that the way the poem is formed reflects the character of the Duke himself. But it goes a little bit further than that as we look at structure, because the poem contains enjambment. Now, when I read the poem just a second ago, it wouldn't have sounded like the lines were rhyming. It wouldn't have sounded obvious where the rhyme scheme was, because although the end of each line rhymes, the sentences actually run over the lines. So the sentence, for example, if you look here, that's my last Duchess painted on the wall looking as if she were alive. That is the sentence. And then this is a sentence. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandow's hands work busily a day and there she stands. So enjambment from the French is the technique where sentences run over the lines. And I think this is quite clever. Number one, because the poem is supposed to be real speech, it wouldn't seem real if the sentences ended at the end of each line and the couplet stopped at the end of each line, because it would sound mechanical. It wouldn't sound like real dialogue. But an alternative interpretation, and you've got to look for alternative interpretations to hit those highest grades in the exam, is that the enjambment reflects actually that the Duke doesn't have complete control. He himself is quite uncontrolled and wild in his anger. So although he does everything he can to control others, which is reflected in the tightly controlled rhyming couplets and the iambic pentameter, the fact is he can't control himself. Seen through the enjambment, he can't stop sort of this blurting out of all this emotion. And also you could say he's uncontrolled because look at what he's talking about. He shouldn't be talking about these things to essentially someone connected with his future wife. So the image that we create, or that is created here, is this crazy man who can't control his outbursts. And of course we can look at the structure as well and say, well, the poem is one long verse. Remember I talked about in structure we should look at where do the verses change, why is that important? But if the verses don't change, if it's just one long verse, that's also important to think about. Why is that? Why is that significant? Well, again, I think it tells us a few things about the Duke. The fact that the verses don't stop and change at all reflects how the Duke doesn't stop. He doesn't stop to think about what he's saying. He just gives his own explanation of events. He doesn't care about his listener particularly. He just spouts out his thoughts in a kind of stream of consciousness style. But we should also consider the effect on the reader. When we read this poem aloud, with no major breaks or pauses because there are no stanza changes, we are overwhelmed, we're almost breathless from the immensity of the poem. And this overwhelming aspect reflects how the Duke himself is an overwhelming character. So again, the form of the poem reflects what the character of the Duke is like. As I said, there's some ambiguity in this poem. It's possible to think that the Duchess is dead and was murdered by the Duke, or that at least he called for her to be murdered because he didn't like the way she was behaving. But it's also possible to think perhaps they, I don't know, split in some other manner. We see this line, as if she were alive. Now, when he's looking at the painting, he says, look at this painting of her, it's as if she were alive. And that can have two possible meanings. It could mean the painting is lifelike. You know, it looks almost photographic in its lifelike representation of my former wife. Or it could mean, look, it looks like she's alive there because she is actually dead. Now, spoiler alert, Browning did give an interview where he explained, and this is a quote, "Yes, I meant that the commands were that she be put to death." And that explains the next line, "I gave commands." So she's smiling all the time and he doesn't like it, and then he just says in this cold, short, brutal line, "I gave commands." It's ambiguous because we think, well, what commands did he give? Did he say to her, look, you need to stop smiling all the time? Or did he give commands that she be killed? And as I said, Browning did give an interview where he said it was about her being killed. The line is ambiguous, but it's important to know that Browning did clarify the ambiguity. So why is the husband unhappy with his wife? He seems to suggest that it's because she's just happy all the time and smiles at everything. But there's an ambiguity in this line as well, where he explains her looks went everywhere. It almost suggests, as I talked about earlier, that he was jealous of what his wife was looking at. Maybe she was eyeing up men. But again, this just seems to be a paranoia, because he was also paranoid that perhaps the artist had given some flirtatious comment, and it doesn't seem to the dispassionate reader that that's likely, given the fact that the artist was a religious figure. So to finish off this analysis, the one way of looking at it is that it is a poem about power. It is a poem about complete control, despotic control that the Duke has, and how he uses that power to have his wife killed for no good reason. Now, if we look at it in that sense, we can interpret the poem as being about male power, gender roles in Victorian England, how men have complete control over women. But there is another way of interpreting the poem, which is to think about it actually as a portrayal of the Duke's weakness, not power. We can think that, his insecurity is seen in this line, her looks went everywhere. So he's looking at his wife, and she is just looking around, smiling at people, and she's happy about everything. And he's paranoid, he's insecure. He thinks this means something when perhaps it doesn't. The fact that his dialogue is this sprawling, in some ways uncontrolled speech, and it seems careless, the details he's giving to the envoy, also suggests weakness. But I think the cleverest thing about this poem is that even if we read the poem at face value, with it being a poem about a man who didn't like the way his wife acted, so he had her killed, that still presents the Duke in some ways as being weak. Because, and this links to the Victorian society again, Browning's poem can be read as a message that Victorian men are weakened by their dependency on the power that they have over women. It can be argued that Victorian men saw their wives as a reflection of themselves, and this disempowered them. Or to put it a different way, why is it so important to the Duke that he has control over his wife? Now, of course, we never hear the wife's side of the story. The silenced voice, again, reflects the absolute control the Duke has. Whenever you study a poem, if it's a dramatic monologue, it's often important that we don't hear the other side of the story. And again, that reflects how, women in Victorian England were silenced, voiceless. Their opinions were not valid. As I said earlier, in a court of law and all the rest of it, women were not seen as important. We don't hear the other side of the story, and that reflects what society was like at the time. In this way, the Duke's desire to control his wife's behaviour can be read as a metaphor for Victorian society's obsession with the behaviour and reputation of women. The fact that Duchess did not reserve her smiles for her husband alone is seen as this huge problem for the Duke. And in the same way, Victorian women were considered to be failures if they didn't give their lives over exclusively for their husbands. So there are two ways of interpreting the poem: male dominance and male power through this oppressive control, or the fact that actually, if he feels that he has to control his wife, and if he feels that what she does is such a reflection of him and on him, then that's weakness, because he should be his own person and his wife shouldn't in any way reflect